6:03 in the evening, the House of Representatives declared that the President of the United States was impeached. 229 votes in favor, 206 against. Articles adopted, power formally challenged. This was the third time in 5 years that a sitting American president faced impeachment in the House, but this one carried a structural difference. For the first time in history, a significant block of the president's own party crossed the line in numbers never seen before. 17 Republicans voted yes. All 212 Democrats present supported impeachment. 1 Democrat was absent. On the Republican side, 189 voted no. 17 voted yes. That is roughly 8% of the House Republican Conference, nearly 1 in 10. In institutional terms, that is not noise, that is fracture. Let me put that in historical sequence so it lands properly. In December 2019, during the first impeachment of Donald Trump, 0 House Republicans voted to impeach. 0. In January 2021, during the second impeachment, 10 Republicans broke ranks. This time, 17. The largest number of cross-party votes in any presidential impeachment in American history. This is not normal. And the justification those 17 Republicans offered was not tactical. It was constitutional. They argued that when a president publicly refuses to comply with a ruling of the Supreme Court of the United States, Congress does not merely have discretion to respond, it has a duty. That is the activation point. Not personality, not policy. Institutional defiance. Representative Adam Kinzinger framed it bluntly. He said his oath was to the Constitution, not to any individual president. If a president ignores a Supreme Court ruling, he argued, that moves from executive disagreement into something closer to authoritarian behavior. In his view, that crosses the impeachment threshold. Representative Liz Cheney reinforced the hierarchy. The United States, she said, is a nation of laws. The Supreme Court is the final interpreter of those laws. If a president rejects judicial authority, he is rejecting the constitutional order itself. That was her reasoning for voting yes. Then came Representative Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin and a former Marine who served in Iraq. He had defended the president before, voted with him on most legislation. But he said that after reading the Supreme Court's decision and then reading the president's response, he concluded that declaring oneself unbound by the court's ruling exceeded constitutional limits. He could not support that position. Here is where the context matters. This impeachment was not built around a personal scandal or a foreign policy dispute. It was built around separation of powers, around whether the executive branch must comply with the judiciary. That is a systemic fault line. At 6:15 in the evening, 12 minutes after the vote closed, the president responded on social media. He called the impeachment illegitimate and void. He argued that Congress has no authority to remove a president for defending executive power against what he described as judicial overreach. He stated that he did not recognize the impeachment. He said he would not participate in any Senate trial. He said he remains president and will continue executing the duties of the office. Pause there. A president declaring that he does not recognize an impeachment proceeding initiated by the House of Representatives, that is escalation from disagreement to institutional standoff. The Senate reacted quickly. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced that the Senate would fulfill its constitutional duty to hold a trial. Chief Justice John Roberts would preside as required when a president is tried. Evidence would be presented, witnesses would be heard, senators would vote on whether defying the Supreme Court warrants removal. The trial, he said, was expected to begin Monday and conclude within 1 week. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell issued a more measured statement. He acknowledged profound concerns about the president's defiance of the Supreme Court. He noted that impeachment and conviction are grave actions. He said, "Senators must determine whether the president's conduct, however troubling, rises to the level requiring removal." He had not yet decided how he would vote. That uncertainty is not small. It is leverage. At 7:23 in the evening, Chief Justice John Roberts confirmed he had been notified of the impeachment and that he would preside over the Senate trial pursuant to Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution. He stated he would ensure the proceedings are conducted fairly and in accordance with Senate rules and constitutional requirements. Now, step back. The House has acted. The President rejects the action. The Senate prepares for trial. The Chief Justice steps into the constitutional chair reserved for moments of maximum tension. This is where the focus shifts from one vote count to the architecture of American power. And the next calculation is not rhetorical, it is mathematical. Now the arena shifts. Under the Constitution, the House impeaches, the Senate tries. Conviction requires 2/3 of the Senate, 67 out of 100. Not a majority, not a strong majority, a supermajority, designed to make removal rare, deliberate, and structurally difficult. This is where the confrontation stops being symbolic and becomes mathematical. The current Senate alignment is simple on paper. 51 seats are held by Democrats and independents who caucus with them. 49 seats are held by Republicans. If every Democrat and aligned independent votes to convict, 16 Republicans must join them to reach 67. 16. That number is now the fulcrum of the American constitutional system. Before the trial even begins, 12 Republican senators had already publicly rejected the president's claim of sweeping emergency powers. The names matter because institutions are carried by individuals. Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Bill Cassidy, Ben Sasse, Richard Burr, Pat Toomey, Rob Portman, Tom Tillis, Shelley Marapo, Joni Ernst. 12. If, and it is still an if, all 12 vote to convict, 4 more Republicans are required. Without them, the effort fails. Here is where you need to slow down and understand the leverage. The public statements made before a trial are signals. Signals reduce uncertainty. Signals create permission structures inside a caucus. Potential additional votes are already being discussed. Mike Rounds of South Dakota has said the Supreme Court's ruling must be respected. Shelley Moore Carpo of West Virginia has described the president's response as inappropriate. Todd Young of Indiana has called for compliance with judicial orders. John Thun of South Dakota has expressed concern about a constitutional crisis. If those 4 join the 12, the number hits 16. Add 51 Democrats, 67 conviction becomes not rhetorical, but arithmetically possible. Let me say that clearly. The difference between removal and survival may come down to 4 individuals. But numbers alone do not decide this. Pressure does. Incentives do. Primary threats, donor pressure, media, ecosystems, they all compress into that Senate chamber. And that is where the scenario matrix emerges. Scenario 1. The Senate convicts with at least 67 votes. The president is removed from office under constitutional succession, whether through the 25th Amendment framework or established line of succession. The acting president becomes president. This would mark one of the most consequential assertions of congressional authority over the executive branch in modern history. Scenario 2. Conviction fails, but narrowly. 63 to 66 votes in favor. The president survives, but weakened. The institutional message becomes ambiguous. Defying the Supreme Court is wrong, perhaps even dangerous, but not quite removable. Accountability attempted, not achieved. Scenario 3. Conviction fails decisively. Fewer than 60 votes to convict. The president declares vindication. The president becomes stark. President can openly defy the Supreme Court and survive if his party closes ranks. This is where the stakes expand beyond one administration, because each scenario rewrites expectations for future presidents. Now consider the indicators that will shape which path materializes. Indicator 1. Does the president rescind the emergency order or announce compliance with the Supreme Court ruling before or during the trial? If he does, some senators may argue the constitutional crisis has been resolved, reducing the need for removal. If he does not, the defiance remains active. Indicator 2. Do any Republican senators publicly commit to voting to convict before the trial concludes? Early commitments create momentum. They also provide political cover for others. Indicator 3. Does the president participate in the trial or boycott it? If he refuses to mount a defense, conviction may become procedurally cleaner, but a boycott could also energize his supporters and frame the trial as illegitimate in their eyes. Indicator 4. What evidence do House managers present? Can they demonstrate that the president's defiance constitutes a structural threat to constitutional order rather than a policy dispute? Indicator 5. Public opinion. If national polling, including among Republican voters, shifts towards supporting conviction, senators gain political insulation. Indicator 6. External shock. Another crisis, another escalation. A statement or action that changes the calculation mid-trial. This is not theater, it is fluid. To understand how unusual this moment is, look backward. In 1868, Andrew Johnson was impeached. The Senate voted 35 to convict, 19 to acquit, 1 vote short of removal. The system strained, but held. In 1999, Bill Clinton was impeached. The Senate voted 50 to 50 on one article, 45 to 55 on another. Conviction was never within reach. In 2020, Donald Trump faced his first impeachment. The Senate voted 48 to 52 on abuse of power and 47 to 53 on obstruction. Only 1 Republican voted to convict. In 2021, during the second impeachment of Donald Trump, the Senate voted 57 to 43. 7 Republicans supported conviction, still 10 votes short. The pattern is unmistakable. Presidential impeachments almost never end in removal. But this case introduces a different axis. The charge is not centered on personal misconduct, not foreign entanglements, not perjury. It is centered on a president declaring he is not bound by a Supreme Court ruling that strikes directly at separation of powers. This is where the narrative shifts from a political fight to an institutional stress test. According to reporting and analysis from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Reuters in prior constitutional confrontations, open defiance of the Supreme Court by a president is widely regarded as a severe challenge to the system checks and balances. The judiciary lacks enforcement power of its own. It relies on compliance by the executive branch. Constitutional scholars speaking on CNN and in reporting by the Associated Press have long argued that if the executive branch refuses to comply with a final Supreme Court ruling, Congress is left with very few tools. The most powerful one is impeachment, which brings us back to the Senate floor. This is not simply a trial about one decision. It is a referendum on whether the judiciary's authority is binding or advisory when confronted by presidential resistance. And if 16 Republican senators conclude that party loyalty outweighs judicial supremacy, the consequences will not end with this vote. The House vote, 229 to 206, now stands as the most bipartisan presidential impeachment in American history. 17 Republicans crossing over is not a footnote. It is a political marker. For the first time, a meaningful bloc within a president's own party has declared that openly defying the Supreme Court crosses an unacceptable constitutional boundary. That line matters because once members of a president's party acknowledge a breach of judicial authority, the argument is no longer purely partisan. It becomes institutional. It signals that the guardrails are not entirely dependent on the opposition party. It suggests internal constraint is still possible. But the real test is no longer in the House. The Senate now walks into this trial carrying two simultaneous pressures. One is political. Senators face voters. They face primary challenges. They face donor networks and activist bases that can punish deviation. That pressure is immediate and personal. The other pressure is constitutional. The oath senators take in an impeachment trial is not to party. It is to do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws. They are being asked to weigh the supremacy of judicial authority against the stability of party alignment. This is where institutional gravity intensifies. Mitch McConnell has not committed to a vote. He has expressed concern about the president's defiance of the Supreme Court. He has acknowledged the seriousness of conviction and removal, but he has not chosen a side. That ambiguity is consequential. McConnell's position has historically shaped the internal boundaries of the Republican conference. If he moves toward conviction, it could recalibrate the center of gravity within the party. If he resists, it could consolidate opposition to removal. One individual, potentially pivotal. Above them all, Chief Justice John Roberts will preside, not as a political actor, but as a constitutional referee. His role is procedural, yet symbolic. He embodies the branch whose authority is at issue. The court has ruled. The president has resisted. Now the Chief Justice oversees the chamber that decides whether that resistance warrants removal. That visual alone carries institutional weight. If the Senate convicts with 67 votes or more, the president will be unmistakable. No president stands above a Supreme Court ruling. Defiance triggers consequence. The separation of powers holds under stress. If the Senate fails to reach 67, especially if the vote falls well short, a different signal emerges. It would suggest that enforcement of judicial authority depends not solely on constitutional design, but on partisan alignment. That removal is possible in theory, but fragile in practice. Let me frame it plainly. The core question is not simply whether one president keeps his office. It is whether a Supreme Court ruling remains binding when confronted by executive refusal and partisan protection. American history has seen moments where institutions bend, but do not break. Andrew Johnson survived by one vote. Bill Clinton survived comfortably. Donald Trump survived twice. Each time, the system absorbed the shock. But this confrontation centers on judicial authority itself. If that authority can be disregarded without removal, future presidents may test that boundary again, not because of ideology, but because precedent permits it. 100 senators will cast votes within a week. Their decision will not just close a trial, it will shape how the principle of checks and balances functions in the next chapter of American democracy. And here is the unresolved tension. If the branch designed to enforce accountability hesitates when judicial authority is directly challenged, what exactly remains as the final safeguard of constitutional order? Thank you for listening. If this breakdown was helpful, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated. See you next.